Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Where No Man Has Gone Before, which is episode 2 of season 1 of Star Trek The Original Series. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my latest user poll for the original series is Where No Man Has Gone Before. So I know a lot of people are going to question my numbering of this episode. Well, it's not really episode 2 of season 1. That's not true. Well, you're correct, actually. I think no one else would actually number it the way that I do, but I decided going forward that I'm going to go by production value or production order rather than air date, because I think the episodes make more sense in production order than in air date order, because they seem completely out of order and inconsistent in air date order. And so I decided that I would call The Cage episode 1 of season 1, even though by any measure it's not in season 1, but it was the first Star Trek episode ever made, so I'm going with that. And the second Star Trek episode ever made was Where No Man Has Gone Before. So that's why I numbered it the way that I do. And I think it's really out of place and out of whack and just completely out of order and doesn't make any sense if you watch this episode later than any other episode other than The Cage. I think it's wrong to do that. I think this is officially air date wise. This was like episode 4, I think. If you watch it on Netflix, they'll show you 3 other episodes that are clearly made after this one first before they get to this. And I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong. This is clearly the first Kirk episode. And it's so it should be viewed in that order. But anyway, this is the second pilot. Has anyone who knows anything about Star Trek, anyone who's watching like some random person talk about Star Trek episodes, surely knows. The first pilot for Star Trek The Original Series failed, and unprecedented. This was an unprecedented event where they actually said, go ahead and make another pilot, which was pretty much unheard of. But they did, so they made this one, and then the network decided to pick up the show based on the second pilot. So, therefore, it was the cast of the second pilot that went on to be in the main show, and the characters, of course. Jeffrey Hunter, who played Pike in the original pilot, was no longer available for the second pilot, so they recast William Shatner, and they got a new character, Captain Kirk, instead of Captain Pike. They had Spock is the only one they kept, and it's funny because one of the studio notes of after the first pilot was get rid of the pointy-ear guy, and that's the only one they kept. But I think they were right to do so. And Spock was actually had this Vulcan characteristics of having no emotions, which he didn't really in The Cage. But they firmly established that here. So I think that actually Spock was kind of like a background character in The Cage, where here he wasn't a background character. He did have lines in some role, but he wasn't like the first officer or second in command the way he was here. So they made him more important. In fact, the network said get rid of this guy, and instead they made him is the only one they kept, and they made him more important. Which is, and then the network still picked it up. So there you go. I don't know, but I think they definitely did a better job at fleshing Spock out. They're making this Vulcan characteristics of being emotionless, whatever. They made that clear in this episode, whereas in The Cage he smiled. So I don't think they really had established that trait yet. Other than that, like, it's the same ship as the Enterprise, but other than that, they pretty much changed everything. Now, the funny thing is that I personally like The Cage way better than this episode. So it's funny to think that The Cage was rejected and that this is the episode that they actually did buy the show on, where honestly, I don't think it's that good of an episode. And it just goes to show that a lot of decisions that movie and TV executives and studios make aren't based off of quality. There's not really, and this is a hard lesson that I learned growing up. I was like, oh, how come there's not any more good movies? There should be more original movies. And I thought naively when I was a teenager that this was because there wasn't enough good ideas. But then as I grew older, I started to learn there are plenty of good ideas. There are plenty of great ideas. It's just the studios don't make them typically, and they usually make the bad ones. Because it's not about making good quality stories or good storytelling. It's about making money. So they're more concerned about what going to make money. Now sometimes these two concepts intercept and you have a good story that makes a lot of money, or sometimes you have like indie movies or more lower budget stories that just happen to slip by and people give it a chance, and some of those studios, the more low budget ones, are more willing to look at quality over cash. But even then, they of course have to be concerned about the bottom dollar because that's the business. But you do have some times where good quality stuff is made. Anyway, this is reinforced for me by the fact that they rejected the cage and they accepted this. It had to do with politics and had to do with what they thought sold or what would sell, what they could sell to a mainstream audience. Granted, because this was not like, it's different in modern times because you have all these niche markets, you have all these streaming services that cater to certain audiences, or cable TV. Well, that's becoming obsolete now, but a lot of the niche markets that can cater to different specific desires. So you have a lot of shows and stuff being made that would never be made back in the 60s because you didn't have that niche market. You just had 3 networks, at least in America anyway, that and that's all you had to deal with. And so everything had to be mainstream. And so what was mainstream at the time was Westerns. And so they had to sell this as a Western, and that's the classic line of "wagon train to the stars," which is a saying that Gene Roddenberry is well known for saying, but I honestly think that was just to appease the studio. That was just to be like, and that's why they gave it the Western tilt. It wasn't a creative decision, it was a business decision. Because that is what was popular at the time, and that's the best way that they could sell it. Now, that being said, this episode didn't come off as completely a Western to me. It was clearly sci-fi, but I suppose you could say it had more of a Western tilt to it, with the settings and the big fight at the end, and man against man. But the story itself was a very cliche kind of. I would say almost, I don't know if monster movie is the term, but like powerful god thing. And this seems to be a theme that Roddenberry was obsessed with in the original series. They went back to this well a lot, where there's a powerful being who's dangerous and messes with the crew. And they do, I realize, because the whole point of the episode is the power corrupts absolutely, and they even say that phrase in the episode. It's very clear that is the sort of moral of the episode, although I think they tell it in a very fucking clunky way. Like, I actually really agree with that saying, but I think the way it was conveyed in this episode is extremely poorly done. Now, getting back to the fact that this is a pilot, though, I think it appealed to the studio because they were fighting, and because they got rid of the female first officer. That was another studio note that they were very adamant about. So the women in this episode they had like a yeoman in the background. The only prominent woman was a psychiatrist who was made fun of for being too cold, and she had a line about how it's more difficult for women to be professionals or whatnot. And quite frankly, I believe that before they got turned into gods, like, Mitchell's behavior to her bordered on sexual harassment. And it's kind of weird for me to see that was seen as the norm in the 60s. So that had to be like, oh, they were just really awkward having women in the workplace. And so they translated to that. And that's what sold. Not having a competent, intelligent, smart female first officer, that did not sell. The studio rejected that outright. But let's have a woman who is, intelligent and competent, but she's made fun of and picked on because of that, and that's seen as okay. And plus, she dies by the end of the episode anyway, so you don't have to deal with her going forward. She's not going to be like a regular cast member or anything. Anywho, so that part irritates me, but overall, I just think, I'll eventually one of these days I will review The Cage, and I will get into why I think that's a smarter, better, well-constructed episode that explores, like, Pike goes through a character journey in that episode, where Kirk doesn't really in this episode, and I think that episode does a better job of exploring Pike. Now, the one thing I will say positive about this episode is I do think it does a good job of establishing Kirk. I think it does a great job of establishing the Kirk and Spock relationship and dynamic. I think that was a selling point that they got right away, and I'm sure that's what helped contribute to the network picking up the show. Of course, later on, McCoy would be added into this dynamic, which was also a stroke of brilliance. But unlike what the air dates order would suggest, McCoy was not there first. He was brought in later on. So in this episode, we just got a Kirk and Spock dynamic, but I think that actually worked. And that was clearly the strength of the episode, was their relationship and how they played off their chemistry, I think is the better term to say, how they played off each other and their connection. I think Kirk himself, although he didn't go through a character journey the way Pike did in The Cage, he did have a very strong characterization to him in this episode. And to be fair to William Shatner, who's acting, I rightfully question often, he actually did a pretty good job in this episode. And I think he really, really wanted this job. So, in fairness to him, you can see that he put a lot of effort into this. But that's probably where my praise of the episode ends. I find the rest of the episode really boring, to be frank. So the episode's about Kirk's long-term friend, Gary Mitchell. And at the very beginning of the episode, he gets, while they're crossing through the Great Barrier because they're leaving the galaxy. I don't know if I should even address the canon in that, because that's rightfully been disregarded in future, because they didn't know what they were doing. This is the first or second ever Star Trek episode ever made, and they had no world-building idea and no sense of what was scientifically accurate. They were like, oh, let's just have a fun space romp. So whatever. I take that for what it is. But anyway, Gary Mitchell gets zapped with this thing that gives him godlike powers, and then he almost immediately turns evil and starts looking at the crew as inferior ants and something to be squashed and ignored, and he's way better than them and has the superiority complex. So that's where that, absolute power corrupts absolutely thing comes in, which, as I said, this is a very poor way of doing it. And I think a lot of the episode seems to hinge on Kirk's friendship with Mitchell and his and I think Shatner does a good job of playing this, but about his fighting his feelings of wanting to save his friend, but having to come to grips with the reality that his friend's gone, and that he actually just needs to kill what's in his place, otherwise it will kill his entire crew and put all of humanity at risk. And him really resisting that to the point, and Spock and Mitchell himself point out in very on-the-nose fashion that Kirk waited too long to do this and almost lost his entire crew because of this, that he was showing weakness by not, by wanting to save his friend. Which, that's an interesting storyline, but again, its execution in this episode I think is terrible. First of all, Mitchell turns evil way too fast. It's funny because I just watched, or they just released Lower Decks episode from my perspective 2 weeks before I'm recording this video, where they were directly parodying this episode. In fact, they even mentioned Gary Mitchell by name in that episode, where the character in that show, Commander Ransom, gets zapped by what they call strange energies, and it turns him into a godlike power. And in that episode, they're like, oh, he's snapped by energy. He's like, oh, he's fine, whatever. And then all of a sudden, just really suddenly, his eyes start glowing. He's like, oh, I'm powerful, and blah, blah. And it's ludicrous, and it's meant to be because it's a comedy and it's played for laughs, how quickly he turned. But the thing is that that's directly making fun of this episode, because that's exactly what happens to Mitchell. Well, obviously not with that ludicrous speed, but go to ludicrous speed of Spaceballs reference. Anyway, not with that ludicrous speed, but still it happens way too fast. Mitchell's turn from being this, regular guy who's good friends with Jim Kirk, to being this, asshole who is controlling and looks at the crew as inferiors. That happens way too fast. Now, several other notes. One is, as I said, the episode hinges on Kirk's feelings for Mitchell and wanting to protect him, yet they don't sell their friendship to me. They mention that they're friends in the first 2 minutes of the episode, and then all of a sudden it gets into Mitchell wanting to kill everyone. So the episode has a lot of telling, not showing that they're good friends and that Kirk has a connection to him. I see William Shatner's his acting, as I said, is good in portraying that he is conflicted about wanting to harm Gary Mitchell, but they never sold me completely on their friendship. And so I have to believe when I'm told that they're good friends rather than being shown that. Now, to be fair, this is a bit harder to buy because before I saw this episode, I was already well familiar with Star Trek, and I've seen all the movies, and I saw most of the other episodes, therefore. And I've never heard of Gary Mitchell before, and they never mentioned Gary Mitchell. So to see this person pop up out of nowhere and be like, oh, we're good friends with Kirk. Are you, though? Because I've never heard of you, and I know all about Kirk, and you've never been mentioned before. Now, and so that is a perspective, because, of course, this is the first episode Kirk ever made. Although, even though it's the fourth to air, it's not the first one to air, though, but still, it's the first one ever made. So from that perspective, it could be, he could have been good friends with Gary Mitchell for years, because we don't know who this guy is. We don't know who Kirk is. We don't know who Mitchell is. But so that's kind of a retrospect perspective, and of course it's the episodic 60s. Of course they're never going to mention Gary Mitchell ever again, except for in B canon, and as I said, Lower Decks. And so so that makes it harder, but I think it's not helped by the fact they didn't do a good job in the first place, even forgetting that future knowledge that I have, even if this was the first ever Star Trek episode I've ever seen. I still don't think I was shown this friendship. And to be frank, as I said, Mitchell was portrayed as an asshole from the beginning. I never thought he was this good guy. He was being a dick to the psychiatrist from the beginning, say, "Oh, he's like a walking fridge," and he was like holding the yeoman's hand and whatnot. He came off as a really cocky asshole, which I guess was seen as more acceptable and normal in the '60s, I suppose. But I already didn't like him even before he got his godlike powers, and so when he did get his godlike powers, it's just like, yeah. This doesn't seem that much different, except now he can move shit with his mind. His personality-wise, he seems the same. So I don't know why Kirk ever liked him in the first place. This guy's an asshole. So, and the other thing to that is this kind of reminds me a bit of episodes like Descent in TNG, Descent Part 2 to be specific in TNG, where Data was his emotion, or he was fed emotions from lore, and his morality chip or whatever, ethics, what they call it, was removed. So he all of a sudden became evil and started torturing Picard and Geordi, which doesn't make any fucking sense. Just because they removed his morality doesn't mean he would torture his friends. And they did the same thing in Voyager and Equinox Part 2 with the Doctor when they removed his morality subroutines or ethical subroutines, and he all of a sudden started torturing his best friend and mentor, protege. He's the mentor. 7 of 9, and helping Captain Ransom, who's an enemy of his own crew, just because they disabled his ethical subroutines, which again makes no sense because it's completely changed the personality of who he is and who he was just because he deleted his ethical. What should have really happened, and I talked about this in my review of Equinox Part 2, is the Doctor should have just killed Ransom without ethics, because it doesn't change who he is. Now, what does that have to do with Mitchell? Well, it seemed like if I'm to believe what I'm told repeatedly throughout the episode, even though I'm never shown it, he's good friends with Kirk. And he's a good guy who values his crew and appreciates his crew. But as soon as he gets his powers, all of a sudden he's like, well, fuck you, Kirk, I want to kill you, and you're just an ant, and I don't give a fuck about you, and I want to destroy the ship. That seems to happen way too fast, out of nowhere, and again, this is why I say it's a very, very clunky way to do absolute power corrupts. That's not how absolute power corrupts works, because as I said, I believe in that saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely, but it doesn't mean that as soon as you get your powers, you change into a total different person, want to go kill all your friends. That is not what it means. It's a lot more complicated than that. Now, there could be some excuses for this, and I've heard there's some B canon that came up with excuses after the fact to try to excuse what's happening here, such as, and there's ones that people could make up in their own personal headcanon as well, such as that these godlike powers actually made him go insane at the same time, so it effectively changed his personality and made him not care about the people he cared about, so he wasn't effectively the same person anymore. Maybe this was like more than just giving him powers, it was like an alien presence that kind of was controlling him in a way, or turning him into a different person altogether, rather than just giving him powers. And there's probably more you can come up with, but I think all of that is, like I said, headcanon. That's all it is. It's excuses that other people come up with after the fact to make up for what is clearly bad writing. Because it is very clear to me that they weren't thinking about any of that when they wrote this episode. That they were just thinking, ooh, he's got godlike powers, so he's evil now. And because absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's not how that works. And you can see, as I said, like Roddenberry does this a lot throughout the original series, and again with Q and TNG, that whenever you have an all-powerful being, they're like evil or asshole-ish, or just a menace to our crew, because when you have powers, having huge powers equals bad. Which is why I actually really like the Next Generation episode, what's it called? Transfigurations. I really like that episode. I found out recently there's a group of people who really hate it and think the episode's horrible, which I personally don't understand. I think it's an underrated episode. But why I'm bringing it up now is because that episode is basically shows someone who's transforming into a more evolved, powerful being, but they're really benign, and they're actually really friendly, and they actually want to use their powers to help people. He heals a lot of the crew, he helps the crew, gives Geordi his confidence. Like, he's a really generous person who wants to help people. And it's a species around him who are afraid of him, who are like, who are trying to kill him, and they killed everyone who was like him because they're afraid. They're afraid of people with power. And so, yeah, and I actually like that message way better than this one. And so, frankly, it seems to me that this episode was written by one of those people who was fearful of John Doe and killed all his friends. And so they're putting this is like a propaganda piece they would write about, anyone who gets powers is going to turn evil and kill everyone, so we need to stop them right away. That's really what this episode seems like to me. Like a simplistic propaganda piece that doesn't really understand any complexities that would actually be involved in a situation like this, and we're acting out of fear of the unknown and fear of someone having all this power. It's like, that automatically turns them evil. And I could just imagine those guys from Transfigurations writing a propaganda piece, and then being this episode. I mean, other than that, I could harp on the fact that it said James R. Kirk instead of James T. Kirk on the tombstone, or that Spock mentioned there was an ancestor that has this distant human genes when really it's his mother, or the fact that Sulu's wearing a blue shirt, or that Scotty's not really the chief engineer. But obviously all this stuff is because this is the first episode with the Kirk crew ever made, and it didn't come up and flesh all this stuff out till later. So that's fine. I don't care about any of that. That's fine. I'm willing to give it a pass for this being the pilot, or the second pilot, but the first one with Kirk and crew. But yeah, and then there was the psychiatrist character who I think was poorly developed, and I didn't really get her. Now, you could say that fight against my argument that was all about they turn evil way too quick, because she actually saves Kirk by attacking Mitchell and allowing Kirk to have that big tough man-on-man fight where he gets his shirt ripped off and can show off his chest. So you could say, she saved the day. But really, they're just saying that because she wasn't, whatever happened, she wasn't turned all-powerful as quickly as Mitchell was. And so she wasn't turned evil as fast as he was. And also, they contributed to Kirk's, moralizing speeches, being like, be a psychiatrist one more time. So yeah, it's kind of the origins of Kirk's, moralizing speeches and whatnot that he'll give throughout the rest of the original series. But that's fine. I kind of like that aspect of Kirk, but whatever. And then I kept seeing that Kelso guy. I think he was the chief engineer in this episode. I was like, how come we never saw him later? But then I forgot that he got killed. And he seemed to get killed for no reason. They just had Mitchell, strangle him with his powers. And it didn't seem necessary to the plot or have to do with anything. Maybe they just didn't want that character around anymore. I don't know. And it didn't have Dr. McCoy in this episode. There was another doctor who was way more boring than McCoy, and I can see why they would replace him. Anyway, so one thing I will say, another thing I liked about this episode is the concept of there being a station, a Federation. Well, they didn't say Federation, obviously, because they hadn't come up with that yet, but in retrospect, let's call it a Federation station that's just out in like the middle of nowhere, like the far reaches of space, that they just set up, and they have it there as like a fueling station. They only like come to visit it like every 20 years. It's like a scientific, I believe they collects data, and they come and get it every 20 years, or they have it there as a, if there's other ships that happen to venture out that far into space, it gives them like a place to refuel, which is exactly what the Enterprise does. It goes there to get repairs. That's a great concept. I actually think they should have used that more in Star Trek, and to my knowledge, I don't think they had. That actually makes a lot of sense to have these really, really remote like stations, like they had other like ships or whatever explore, so they send that out, and they build the station in a very remote area just to have it so that Starfleet ships that are venturing out far from their home bases have a place that they can refuel for repairs, even if it's unmanned. Now, I do get that leaving like unmanned outposts out in the middle of nowhere where aliens can just come by and steal their technology might be a bad idea, but surely they could have security precautions for in such an eventuality. But yeah, I like the concept, and it had a nice eeriness to it. It did give, that's another positive I'll say about the episode. It gave a nice eeriness to it, that they were pretty much out in the middle of nowhere. It had that Western feel, I suppose. It was like a ghost town or whatever, because they're out in the middle of nowhere, very far away from civilization, and there's no one around to help them. So that gave it a nice eerie feel as well. So I wish they would have used this more. I like that concept. Anyway, my rating for Where No Man Has Gone Before out of 10 is a 4 poor. Yeah, I think the positives of the episode is the Kirk and Spock relationship, but that's a positive in almost every episode. It's different here, of course, because this is the first time these characters ever appear, so they do a really good job of establishing their relationship from the get-go. So as a pilot, it works in that regard. And as I said, the eeriness of it, the being in a remote location, works as well. But pretty much everything else about this episode doesn't work for me. The plot is really boring and not a very original concept. To do a horrible job at executing the plot. I don't buy Mitchell as Kirk's friend. I don't buy that he turns evil so quickly. I don't buy his godlike, I want to kill everyone. And it just comes off as really cheesy and unbelievable, and for the most part the episode's boring. It just takes a long time, like reiterating, Kirk said I don't want to kill my best friend, but he's evil. I don't want to kill my best friend, but he's evil. Yeah, we get it. Like, it's just you reiterates that point over and over and over again, and to me that is not interesting storytelling. But as I said, the Kirk and Spock relationship and other aspects of it works, so that's why it gets a 4, not anything less than a 4, but I still think it's a poor episode. Anyway, that is it for my review of Where No Man Has Gone Before. Be sure to check out my channel for many more reviews on Star Trek and other shows like Better Call Saul, Star Trek Lower Decks, Star Wars, Clone Wars, and The Expanse. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.